Hey everybody, it's Emily at Arc Schooling, and today I'm going to start a video series where I talk about things I love in books and share some recommendations. I have been wanting to film this specific thing for way too long. I keep putting it off because every time I sit down to try to come up with my list of both things that I love and then books to recommend, my mind goes completely blank. Does this happen to anybody else? Where somebody says, hey, what's your favorite book? And you have nothing to say because you just forget everything you've ever read? Well, that was me making this list. So it's taken me forever, but I think I've got a place to go here. I have enough to go on that I think we can do it. My list was way too long, so I'm going to divide this into groupings. I don't know how many videos this series will be. We're just going to kind of go with it and see what happens. So what I want to start with is a thing that I love in books, and then I'll give you guys some recommendations based on that. So to start, let's talk about books with big ideas to chew on. I love a really good thought-provoking story. I love a book that I can sit with and think about. And so some of the books that I think are perfect examples of that for me would be Small Gods by Terry Pratchett. This is not the first of the Discworld books that I read, but one of the first. And it's definitely the first that I read where I went, okay, this is now my new favorite author, and I want to read everything. Small Gods is one of his Discworld books where he focuses on the ideas of religion. And so it's a lot about why we believe the things that we do and what happens when you're faced with this idea that maybe all of that is wrong and maybe none of it really happened the way it was taught to you, and how do you deal with that internally, the idea of becoming an atheist and that sort of thing. But I just found it fascinating, but also so funny. And so this book is still one I think about on the regular. I've read it probably 8 years ago and I still think about it all the time. I cannot talk about thought-provoking books without bringing up Arc of the Scythe, because Neal Shusterman's Arc of the Scythe trilogy is peak thought-provoking, amazing world building for me. I think about that book all the time. The concepts he has brought up in this series about immortality are just so thought-provoking. The idea of what happens to humans when we live forever and nothing bad ever happens to us. You lose your sense of creativity. You start to lose passion for things because passion comes from the shortness of life. That idea, it was so interesting to me. But he also talks so much about not just mortality, but ideas of religion and ideas of what is the best way to lead humans and government and that sort of thing. There's so much there. There's so many different ideas he brings up in this series that it's just endlessly fascinating to me. The idea of being an unsavory, people who naturally have this desire to be different, to be bad, giving them an outlet for that where they can do that in a safe way. It's so good. And my second favorite series of all time, the Chaos Walking trilogy, is also equally fascinating. A world where men's thoughts are paraded out for you. You can see everything, you can hear everything that crosses their mind, and how they handle that, and the fact that women don't do that, and how everyone kind of deals with that internal struggle when some of them's internal struggle is on the outside, and the concept of colonization, taking things that you think you're entitled to because you're a human and you've come to this planet, and then the ramifications of being there, being that you have this noise. And it's just really interesting. Also, I really loved the character relationships in this book because it's one of the very few YA series I've ever read that has a male and female character main protagonists, and they are not in a romantic relationship. It's purely platonic, and I just thought that was amazing. So, very thought-provoking. I have to talk about Parable of the Sower. And honestly, Octavia Butler in general, her books, I haven't read everything. I've only read, I think, at this point, 3 of her books, but they are very thought-provoking. My favorite was Parable of the Sower, followed very closely by Kindred. And both of those books explore such interesting facets of humanity. And I think Parable of the Sower does something similar, but very different, to Arc of the Scythe, where we start talking about like the foundations of building religions. Maybe I should have a category for that specific thing, because like those all have that specific piece, like Small Gods and Arc of the Scythe and Parable of the Sower, where we're talking about this idea of creating religion and how you convince people to follow this specific belief system and these specific ideas. And yeah, it's really, really interesting. Kindred does so many interesting things, from time traveling to like the fact that the time travel is involuntary, that it just spontaneously happens, that you're being pulled to a specific ancestor and a specific place. It's just really interesting seeing how a modern woman handles being in the antebellum South, and how it affects her in both places and times. And I just found that book so interesting. Also, it only got 1 season, but the TV show they made for Kindred was really well done. Really, really good. I'm so mad that they aren't going to pick it up for a season 2, because I thought it was amazing. Another book that I found incredibly thought-provoking was Babel by R.F. Kuang. This book solidified that this is a favorite author for me, that I would read anything that they write, because this book was gorgeous and so interesting. Like, from the magic system being linguistic based, which I just thought was the most interesting way to go about it, in a setting where like everyone has to know these different languages so that the magic system can be upheld, and the way that they used the magic and the concepts that they did that with like colonization and stuff, it was all really, really interesting. And again, a book I think about all the time. I've read it twice now, and it was better the second time. Like, I loved it the first time too, but the second time I read it, I just got so much more out of it. And then the last book I had on this list, there's a lot for this one, was Bruiser by Neil Shusterman. This is a lot quieter of a book. It's only following a few characters. We're following a boy who takes on the pain of others, and the pain he takes on is like left on his body. So for example, if you fall down the stairs and twist your ankle and he touches you, your ankle will be fine now. You won't have any more pain. Your ankle is perfectly fine, but his ankle will be injured. So the idea of like, why would he do this for other people when it hurts him so much? And how other people treat him, knowing about this power that he has. And like, would you be willing to take advantage of that because you don't want to feel that pain, and you know that you'd be fine if he were to be close to you, but like, do you want him to be hurt? Like, it's really interesting, and the way that different characters all like react to knowing about that aspect of his ability, and the way they treat him and the way he treats other people and what he's willing to sacrifice and do. Like, it was just really interesting. So now I want to talk about books with really amazing characters. Like, for me, when I'm reading, I need to have really great characters. Like, I would also like a really great plot. I love that too, but if you have a great plot but the characters are flat, I can't get into the story. Like, I need someone to root for. I can't enjoy the book if I'm not falling in love with these characters. I have to talk about The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. This is like one of my all-time favorite books, and to me, these are like the epitome of great characters because they all feel like real people. Like, I have a hard time sometimes when I think about this book remembering that these are fictional humans. Like, they're not real. They don't actually exist, but they feel like they do because they're so vivid and so well drawn. Like, this is his magnum opus. I've tried to read other books by this author and I just like that they're not as good as The Book Thief, so like I don't want to read them. Like, they're just such rich and interesting characters. And Babel, again, the characters in Babel I think are all so interesting and different. I really enjoy all of them, but like specifically Victoire's character I thought was really, really like so compelling, and I almost wish that she was the main protagonist because I wanted more. I found her the most compelling of all of the characters, but they were all really, really interesting. And then Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. This book is one of the few specifically character-based books that I really loved. Usually I need both the characters and the plot. Like, if it's just character heavy but there's no plot, I tend to get a little bored. But if there's too much of one or the other, usually the book doesn't quite work for me. But this book is almost entirely character-based. Like, there's not much plot. But I found it so interesting and so compelling, both the world building that she created for these characters, but also just the characters. They were so interesting, like so different. This is also one of the things that I love in like sci-fi, where you have like this really intriguing world that is created where like different species get along, different kinds of people can learn to get along, and you see them like in these distant planets and traveling through space and spacecrafts, and like they're all so different. And you would think in our world like this would never work, this dynamic would fall apart very quickly, but in her books they all get along really well, and it's just really interesting to see how they all interact. And I just found it really like I would love this to be adapted, because I want to see it. I want to see these characters come to life. A book I just read, Mayfly by C.J. Lead. I would put it here. Like, I wanted to include it somewhere, and I feel like it works here because Mayfly is such a dynamic character. Like, she is telling the whole story. Like, it's all in her head, so you're with her the whole way through, and so she needs to be able to like pull the story off and make it believable. And I think she did such a good job with that. Like, Mayfly is so disturbing and so compelling, and like you both love her and like are completely disgusted and afraid of her both at the same time. Like, she's a horrible person, but she's so interesting and compelling, and you can't help but being like, wow, what is she gonna do next? And so yeah, definitely one of my new favorite characters. And then of course The Girl with the Louding Voice by Avid would have to go into this category because Aduni is such an amazing character. She's so strong and so committed to what she wants in life. This is a book that's just following Aduni and her life as she's fighting for her right to an education. And she's just such an amazing character because like she's desperate to learn and she wants so much to be able to do something with her life and better herself, and she has to get through all these different obstacles in her path before she can get there. And I just find her such an amazingly like rich character. Again, she just leaps off the page and feels like a real person. Now let's talk about, I don't know if I want to call this retellings, because they're not all specifically retellings, but kind of a retelling. The idea of like telling a story in a new way, taking a story that everybody knows and putting a different spin on it. That is something that I've discovered that I really like. So the first one I want to talk about is Fatal Throne, The Wives of Henry VIII Tell All, because this is one of my favorite Tudor books. And I've read a lot of books about the Tudors. I've been through an entire like Tudor phase where I just want to read nothing but that. And this is one of my favorites because the way they go about telling about the wives is so different from what so many other books do, and that it gives them each a very distinct voice and shows that they were a dynamic human, not just a wife who displeased her husband, you know, like they were real people, and it makes you realize that they were real people. It makes them feel less flat and less like a foil for Henry VIII and more of like these were real women, and terrible things befell them for various reasons. And so I just find it really, really well done. Like even Jane Seymour's story was really compelling. And like I usually think of her as like my least favorite of Henry VIII's wives because she's always made to seem like so insipid and so plain and so bland, because she's following after Anne Boleyn, who is such an like fascinating, dynamic person. So like even the fact that they made her story, poor little Jane Seymour, like an actual interesting character, I thought that was really, really cool. Most Ardently, this was by Gabe Cole Novoa, and it is a Pride and Prejudice retelling. And I read this at the end of last year, and it was like one of my new favorite books. I love the remix series, I think is what it's called, and I love how this story got told in such a really interesting way. In this version of the story, Lizzie Bennet is a trans man, and so the whole story revolves around him trying to like figure out how to get his mother to know and understand and stop trying to set them up with all these different men, and meeting Darcy and realizing that Darcy is a gay man and like building this relationship, and like but meeting Darcy when they are Oliver instead of when they are Lizzie. And so like, and how different the dynamic is between them in each scenario. Like I just thought this book was excellent. Like one of the best retellings I've read in a long time. I just read James by Percival Everett, and that is also like a really fascinating take on a well-known story. James is a retelling of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, but in this case Jim, or James, is the main protagonist. And so it's the same concept of like the two of them kind of teaming up and traveling down the river, but it takes on an entirely different vibe. Like the feeling in the story is so different. Like when I read Huck Finn, it's almost funny and like silly and more of a satirical kind of story, kind of poking fun at the antebellum South. But this version of the story is a lot more somber, a lot more serious, because you're like following James, who is a runaway slave who is trying to figure out how to rescue his family from being enslaved and how to survive this world that wants to chain him up and sell him off down the river. And it is so different, but also there's enough of the same elements in the story that it feels familiar, like the world feels familiar, but it's also just like an entirely new story. I want to include The Song of Achilles here by Madeline Miller. I loved this when I read it a few years ago, so much so that I own 2 copies. I have like my reading copy and my shelf copy because it's so pretty. But this is a retelling of the Iliad, but you're getting the story from Patroclus's perspective, and he's telling the story of Achilles and their relationship. And it is so beautiful, so well written. Like, you can tell Madeline Miller is an expert and she knows her mythology inside and out, and she loves these characters, and I found it to be so beautiful. Like, this book made me cry. It maybe had so many different emotions than I was expecting to have reading a story that I've already read before. You know, I've read the Iliad. I've read other books based on the Iliad, so I thought I knew the story pretty well, but I still got so much out of it. And then Beautiful Little Fools I read a few years ago, and it was one of my favorite books that year. This is by Gillian Cantor, and it is a retelling of The Great Gatsby, but it's told from the perspective of the women characters in the story. And I already loved The Great Gatsby. It's one of my favorite classics, and so I was interested in what she was going to do with that, but she does such an interesting job of completely flipping the story and taking it in a direction you weren't expecting. There's this whole element of like murder mystery involved in the plot that at first I was confused by, because I'm like, we all know how Gatsby dies, don't we? Like, it's pretty clear, but the way she tells the story and like builds up the suspense of like, well, who did actually kill Gatsby was so interesting, and it made me view these characters in such a different way. Like, Gatsby's no longer this romantic hero because you see him from a perspective that like maybe it's not as clear cut as that. And so it was a really interesting way to tell that story. And then of course Legendborn by Tracy Deonn, taking on the Arthurian legends in such a different way and exploring these ideas of like magic and hierarchy and all of that, and through the perspective of a Black woman who is just sort of discovering that she has powers and how those powers work and where they came from, and like infiltrating this very like, not, I don't want to call it white supremacist, but kind of white supremacist group, and finding out like her place in their society. And it's so interesting, and I really need to read Bloodmarked because I'm worried I'm going to start to forget what happened in Legendborn the further away I get from it. But I loved that book so much when I read it. It was so different from what I was expecting, and so intriguing. The way the magic system was set up, and like the way that she set up the Arthurian legends in this book, and how she uses those legends to build like a secret society was so interesting. And I think I'm going to stop there. I think we're going to do this in groups of 3 because otherwise these videos are going to get way too long. So let me know down below if those are things that you also love in books. What are some things you think I should read? Recommend me some titles in the comments down below. And also tell me, what are some things that you love in books? Maybe I can come up with some ideas for a series of things where I recommend that kind of thing to you. So yeah, so let me know down below, what are some books that you think I should read based on these categories, and what are some categories of things you love in books? Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys in my next one. Until then, happy reading. Bye.